On page 134F, we had described last time, in fact, that we have all these hormones. And don't think that I've covered all the hormones. There are hundreds of them. Hundreds. And they keep discovering new ones every month, as I will tell you a little bit more about later today. So they've now actually found that bone cells release hormones, fat cells release hormones. So they're basically discovering almost every tissue in the body produces hormones. So the classic view of an endocrine gland is totally breaking down with further research. But of the hormones that we have spoken of, and even those that I haven't, they all play important roles and allow us to function normally, but they're not absolutely essential to life. We mentioned that last time. We said that a woman who doesn't have estrogen doesn't die, but obviously she's not normal. A guy without testosterone doesn't die, he just feels there's no point in living. You don't die if you don't have growth hormone. You may be short, but you're not dead. Hypothyroidism, you're going to be low in energy, you're going to be tired all the time, you'll be cold, you gain weight, but you don't die. So the vast majority of hormones are not absolutely essential to life. They're essential to being normal, but not just to be alive. But we said that last time that there are 4 hormones that are absolutely essential to life. A deficiency of these 4 hormones, any one of them, you'll be dead in a week, within a week. So of the 4 that are listed here, insulin, cortisol, aldosterone, and parathyroid hormone, the only one of the 4 that we had talked about so far is glucocorticosteroids like cortisol. And as I mentioned last time, to be honest with you, I cannot explain, nor do I think anybody else can explain, exactly in what way it is essential to life. But we do know that somebody who has a deficiency of it, which is known as hypoglucocorticosteroidism or Addison's disease, without taking replacement therapy, without having that person take replacement cortisol every day, or a synthetic that mimics it, like prednisone, they will die. So the whole actions of cortisol we saw last time are bizarre. The fact that it promotes the breakdown of proteins in our body into sugars, even if one of the benefits is, yes, it provides more sugar for energy, it's still pretty traumatic in the body to break down the proteins, including the proteins in your muscles, and the conversion of even the sugars to fats. And the fact that it suppresses the immune system by lowering the lymphocyte count and has an anti-inflammatory action, preventing the release of chemical mediators of inflammation. Why is that happening? And why is that essential to life? So I think, as I pointed out last time, clearly we do not fully understand this hormone and its role in the body and the totality of what it's really involved in. Don't think that we, as we said last time, that we understand everything about anything. We don't understand the totality of anything in the body. The human body is very complicated. All you can do is bet that, as we said last time, every month that goes by, we discover new things that we didn't know. Now, the other 3 hormones, though, I think I can present a case as to why they're essential to life. Insulin. If you know of somebody who has to take insulin every day and it's got to be injected, if they don't take their insulin for about 3 or 4 days, they're dead. So it is absolutely essential to life. Now, let's review insulin. On the previous page, 134E, I'll remind you that we originally talked about insulin and its kind of antagonist, glucagon, back in section B, when we were learning about cellular respiration. We talked about the 2 hormones that regulate our blood sugar level. And these are kind of the yin and yang of the regulation of our blood sugar level. You'll recall that insulin is secreted by the so-called beta cells of the pancreatic islets, whereas glucagon is secreted by the so-called alpha cells of the pancreatic islets. What does insulin do? It lowers our blood sugar level. How? By activating transporter proteins in cell membranes to transport or take up sugar from the bloodstream and transport it into the cells. That's actually specifically a facilitated diffusion or passive transport. It doesn't require ATP, but the transporter protein does facilitate the transport of glucose into the cell. And as the sugar is taken up into the cells out of the bloodstream, it lowers the amount of sugar in the blood, and it makes sugar available to most cells as a source of energy. And in the liver cells specifically, the sugar is primarily joined together to form a polysaccharide called glycogen, where it's stored. And this, of course, is a reversible process. Glucagon does the exact reverse of that. You'll recall, we learned this back in section B, so I would encourage you to go back and review that. Glucagon promotes not glycogenesis, but glycogenolysis in the liver cells, causing the stored glycogen, the polysaccharide, to be broken back apart into glucose and release that glucose back into the bloodstream, raising the blood sugar level. But in addition to these two hormones affecting blood sugar levels, they affect other things as well. Insulin not only promotes in liver cells the conversion of sugars into glycogen, which is an anabolic process. You're joining smaller monosaccharides into a polysaccharide. It also promotes lipogenesis, the joining of fatty acids together to form triglycerides in fat cells. And it also promotes protein synthesis, the joining of the amino acids together to form proteins in all the cells of the body, including liver cells. So one thing that we do notice is that all of the actions of insulin are growth related, anabolic. Anabolic is needed for normal growth. Anabolic is needed for repair and healing in the body in order to manufacture new proteins. Yeah, this is an anabolic process which is needed for repair of body tissues. So clearly, without insulin, there are other hormones. There are many hormones that promote catabolic processes, but insulin is uniquely the only hormone that has exclusively and solely anabolic actions in the body. Now again, if you've forgotten what anabolic truly means, we covered it back on page B1, and that's what we went through. Converting monosaccharides into polysaccharides, converting fatty acids into triglycerides, converting amino acids into polypeptides or proteins, converting nucleotides into nucleic acids. That's what we said way back on page B1. So those are called anabolic. Now, glucagon has the opposite actions. Everything it does is catabolic. So it promotes the breakdown of glycogen into glucose and its use as a source of energy, the breakdown of triglycerides into fatty acids, the breakdown of proteins, and even the conversion of proteins into sugars called gluconeogenesis, which is similar to cortisol. So you might say, well, wait a second, Professor Fink, you said insulin is important because it's the only hormone that does all anabolic. Aren't you saying that glucagon, everything it does is all catabolic? Doesn't that make it absolutely essential to life? There are many other hormones that also promote catabolic processes besides glucagon. We saw that growth hormone promotes glycogenolysis and lipolysis. Cortisol promotes protein catabolism and gluconeogenesis. So there is an overlap among various catabolic hormones and what they do. So you can survive without the glucagon, but there's only one insulin, one hormone that promotes anabolic of everything. Of all the hormones we've talked about so far, the only one that had any anabolic action, growth hormone, promotes protein synthesis. But it also causes glycogenolysis and lipolysis. It's a mix. And also so is thyroxine. But insulin, there's really no other hormone that exclusively in its entirety, in its totality, promotes anabolic processes. That's the best I can do in suggesting why it's essential to life. We probably will learn that it has other roles as well. Because, again, there's all these journals on diabetes, and we know that diabetes is a complex problem. It's fundamentally due to a deficiency of insulin, but clearly even people who take insulin every day still develop other problems. So there's other things going on here. As far as what causes the release of insulin, since it causes sugar to go from the bloodstream into the cells, having too much sugar in your bloodstream it will trigger the beta cells of the pancreatic islets to release insulin. The parasympathetic state. These autonomic motor neurons innervate the pancreas, including the islet cells, and they stimulate the beta cells of the pancreatic islets to release insulin. What would reduce the release of insulin? Low blood sugar levels, because insulin is just going to make that worse. So low blood sugar levels turn off the release of secretion of insulin by the beta cells, and during a stress state, a sympathetic action, that turns off the release of insulin. As far as glucagon, it's the exact opposite. I mean, the nice thing about the symmetry of physiology and the way the body works is if you learn one, the antagonist is always the opposite. The glucagon is released when your blood sugar level's too low because it promotes glycogenolysis that raises your blood sugar back up, and a sympathetic state causes the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets to release glucagon. All right, so that's just a review, and I would encourage you to go back and review those earlier notes when we first talked about insulin and glucagon. Now, back on the next page on 134F, now that we've reviewed insulin, now the third hormone that's absolutely essential to life are the mineralocorticosteroids, including aldosterone. I'm going to be talking about them very shortly, but I'm going to skip them for the moment. And so the fourth hormone that is absolutely essential to life is called parathyroid hormone. Now, parathyroid hormone fundamentally is a hormone that maintains, it ensures the right amount of calcium in your bloodstream. And why is calcium in our bloodstream so important? We first actually reviewed the need for calcium back at the end of Section A, when I reviewed vitamins and minerals in the body. I don't know if anybody remembers that. We talked about fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. We talked about macronutrient minerals and micronutrient or trace minerals. And the calcium was the very first mineral we mentioned. It is needed for many things. It's a coenzyme needed for many things, including muscle contraction and blood clotting. So muscles will not contract without calcium. So if the calcium levels in our bloodstream go down, it will impair, it will affect the ability of our muscles to contract. That includes not only skeletal muscles, which includes incidentally the diaphragm muscle, it also includes all muscle, including heart muscle, cardiac muscle. So it won't contract normally. So for that reason alone, if the parathyroid hormone is what regulates the calcium levels in the blood, then if that calcium level drops, the muscles aren't going to contract, and you'll be dead. Calcium is also a coenzyme needed for blood clotting. Again, we talked about that at the end of Section A. So we need to be able to clot our blood because we all cut ourselves periodically, and we don't want to bleed to death. So what creates that blood clot that seals off our vessels so that we don't bleed to death is a blood clotting reaction that requires a number of enzymes and coenzymes, including calcium. So if the calcium levels in the blood go down, you have reduced ability to clot your blood and prevent hemorrhaging or bleeding. Now, where does parathyroid hormone come from? So this is my extraordinary picture. So it's certainly not so extraordinary so you could draw it. This is the thyroid gland. Surrounding the thyroid gland are 4 little glands, each about the size of a pea. They're not really green, even though I made them green like a pea. But they are about the size of a pea. They're called parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands. And para meaning around. And they are what secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Now, in fact, there is another hormone that affects calcium levels that is produced by special cells in the thyroid gland. And you may or may not have ever heard of them before. There are special cells in the thyroid gland. They don't secrete thyroxine. These are cells called parafollicular cells. And I know you might be saying, I can't even read your writing. Well, we're going to see that it's all written down for you on the previous page. But anyhow, parafollicular cells These are special cells in the thyroid gland, scattered in the thyroid gland, that secrete a hormone called calcitonin. Obviously, from its name, it must affect calcium levels. So let's try to clarify these two hormones. These two hormones, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, are the yin and yang of calcium regulation. Just like insulin and glucagon were the yin and yang, the one that increases or the one that decreases sugar levels in the blood. All right, let me first talk about calcitonin. This is the one that's not essential to life. We still should have it to be normal, but this is the less important of the two. It's known as calcitonin or thyrocalcitonin because it's from the thyroid gland. And it's released, and it specifically affects, it activates your osteoblasts. Now you might remember vaguely from anatomy, having learned that there were two types of bone cells, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Usually when students first hear that, they say, you gotta be kidding. You know, my gosh, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. The only difference in the words is a B or up there, a C. We'll get to. The osteoblasts are the bone cells that actually form, that secrete calcium salts. So in other words, they promote bone formation or ossification. The way the osteoblasts actually work is they transfer calcium in the bloodstream, and they transfer calcium from the bloodstream and deposit it in the bone tissue. So that increases the amount of calcium mineral in our bones. And the calcium is primarily in the form of these calcium salts called calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. You learned that in anatomy, so I'm assuming you still remember it. But if you don't, write it down. Calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. We actually, again, talked about this way back in section A, at the end of A, when we dealt with calcium and phosphate, phosphorus. Anyhow, why calcitonin is important, therefore, you'll notice that calcitonin ensures that there's sufficient calcium mineral in our bones, keeping our bone density high, keeping our bones strong, and ensuring there's sufficient amounts of calcium mineral in our bones so that they're strong. But what effect is calcitonin having on the amount of calcium in our bloodstream? What does calcitonin do to the amount of calcium in our bloodstream? It's lowering it. Calcitonin is activating the osteoblasts, which are transferring calcium out of the bloodstream into our bones. That's lowering the amount of calcium in our bloodstream and raising the amount of calcium in our bones. Everybody got that? So it is important because it keeps our bones strong, but it does lower the calcium in our bloodstream. Now, parathyroid hormone, here abbreviated PTH, has the exact opposite action. Parathyroid hormone, or PTH, activates, let me do that better. Good. Okay, it activates the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are the bone cells that actually break down bone tissue. They dissolve bone tissue. They break down the calcium salts. This is called bone resorption. Now, what they're actually doing then, the osteoclasts, is transferring the calcium that's in the bone. They are transferring it back to the bloodstream. They're transferring the calcium back to the bloodstream. Now, that's reducing the amount of calcium mineral in our bones, but it is raising the calcium in our bloodstream. So the reason why the parathyroid hormone is essential to life is this is the one that ensures minimal sufficient amounts of calcium in our bloodstream that is needed for muscle contraction and blood clotting. So they're both important because obviously this is a classic example again of homeostasis. Just as our body, using insulin and glucagon, try to maintain our blood sugar level at a constant state, irrespective of whether it's going down or up, it tries to keep it constant. Just like our temperature control center tries to keep our body temperature constant in a constant state, whether it's cold outside or hot outside. Similarly, these two hormones are regulating the set point, the level of the calcium in our bloodstream, trying to keep that at a set point, at a constant level. All right, let's summarize what these two hormones do by looking at the previous page, 134E. So on 134E at the bottom left, parathyroid hormone and thyrocalcitonin. Parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid gland. Thyrocalcitonin is secreted by the, there it is written more clearly, parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. What does parathyroid hormone do? It raises the calcium levels in the blood by activating the osteoclasts. What does thyrocalcitonin do? It lowers the calcium level in our blood by activating the osteoblasts. What would cause parathyroid hormone to be released? Low blood calcium levels, because it's going to raise the calcium levels back up in the bloodstream. Conversely, what would cause calcitonin to be released? Where the blood calcium levels are too high. You just had a glass of milk, you've just absorbed a lot of calcium, and you know what? You don't need all that calcium in your blood right now. It's higher than it should be. So that will cause the release of calcitonin from these parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, and that will they will activate the osteoblast to transfer some of that calcium in your bloodstream into your bones. So your bones act as a reservoir, as a way of storing the calcium to ensure not only that you have strong bones, but that the calcium levels in your blood are normal. All right, now obviously what inhibits it is always the reverse. Now, a question came up in the afternoon class, and I was going to mention it briefly anyhow, and that was the question of how does Boniva work? All right, let me give you a little bit of background on this before I talk about Boniva or Fosamax or some of these Actonel and some of these others. These sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, of course, they affect the body in a lot of ways. They obviously are needed for reproductive function and maleness or femaleness and so on. They also, both of these hormones also tend to activate or stimulate or promote osteoblasts, which cause calcium to be transferred to the bloodstream and to the bone. So it's not just calcitonin, but also the sex hormones have a role in that. So as long as a guy is producing testosterone and a female is producing estrogen, that ensures enough calcium in their bones and maintains bone density. Now guys continue to produce testosterone their whole life. So they've got both calcitonin and testosterone promoting bone density. But women at menopause, we know the ovaries stop working. I'll remind you of something we mentioned previously. The pituitary gland continues to work in both a man and a woman, a person's whole life. So a woman's pituitary is still releasing FSH and LH every month. But the ovaries are, in a sense, quote, burned out. They stop responding to the FSH or LH. So it's not that the pituitary stops working, it's the ovaries stop responding. In fact, postmenopausal women have very high levels of FSH and LH in their bloodstream. It's just that the ovaries aren't responding to it. So if the ovaries don't respond, that means they don't develop eggs, they don't ovulate, and the ovaries don't secrete estrogen. So the estrogen levels of a woman drop at menopause when the ovaries stop working. Now, up until about 10, 15 years ago, most women, as they approached the age of menopause, around 50 years of age, would go to their gynecologist, and the gynecologist would write out a prescription for what's called hormone replacement therapy, or estrogen. And the woman would take estrogen. It was used to be one of the top 10 most prescribed drugs. And then, about 12 years ago, a large clinical study was done showing that postmenopausal women who take estrogen have a slightly increased risk of dying from things like strokes and cancer and other things. So, doctors are risk aversive because if they do something that can cause a problem, they'll be sued for it if it goes wrong. So there's some doctors who still will, but very low levels. But basically, most women today don't take estrogen postmenopausally. So, but there's still this concern, we said, that with the drop in the estrogen hormone level, so the osteoblasts are being less activated. There's still calcitonin, but there's no longer the estrogen. But the osteoclasts are still breaking down bone tissue at the normal rate as usual. So this tends to lead to osteoporosis, a reduction in bone density, especially in women more so than men. Happens in men as well, but it's mostly in women. So they developed a whole new class of drugs that are called bisphosphonates. And this is a very important group of drugs. And also people going into dentistry or dental hygiene. This is going to be really important as well. The bisphosphonates include Fosamax, Boniva, Actonel, and so on. And how do they work? So postmenopausal women usually take these to maintain bone density. They actually inhibit osteoclasts. They inhibit the osteoclasts. So on 134F, by inhibiting the osteoclasts, they slow down the breakdown of bone tissue. So it's not that they are increasing osteoblasts, but they are slowing down osteoclasts. Having said that, there is a synthetic calcitonin available now, where women can be prescribed, and other people can be prescribed calcitonin. And of course, older people, and again, especially women, are encouraged to increase their calcium intake and take more vitamin D as well, which is needed for uptake and absorption of the calcium, among other things. So this is to reduce osteoporosis. Why osteoporosis becomes a big issue is that in the elderly people, when they fall, they break bones. And one of the most common things that happens in old people is broken hip bones, which is a misnomer. It's a broken thigh or femur. So you probably know older people who broke their hip, really their thigh bone, because their bones are weak. So this is a very big issue, and that's big surgery. And it takes a year, 2 years to recuperate from a hip replacement. So you want to maintain bone density. So why this becomes also very important in dentistry is that for those few individuals who take very high levels of these bisphosphonates, especially by IV administration rather than taking it orally, has a strange adverse effect. It can cause necrosis or damage to the mandible, and literally can cause destruction of the entire mandible. So this is, you'll hear a lot more about this in the dentistry and dental hygiene field. They give high levels of these hormones for people with metastatic bone cancer. Again, I'm not going to get into the whole clinical aspect of all that. That's what you'll be learning in your clinical years.